moderated by Xavier University Professor of Theology, Dr. Adam Clark, and will feature the voices and wisdom of Reverend Damon Lynch III, the pastor of New Prospect Baptist Church, community activist and small business owner Iris Rowley, and Reverend Nelson Pierce, who serves as the senior pastor of Beloved Community Church and is also the director of the Faith and Race program in Xavier University's Center for Faith and Justice. My name is Jeff, and I serve as a member of Bellarmine Chapel's Dismantling Racism team. And we are pleased to be convening this online gathering tonight in partnership with Xavier University's Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice. It turns out that it's tragically even more timely that we are sharing in this conversation this evening in our nation in an effort to shine the light of the lives of people of color. We're grateful for the ongoing work of Dr. Clark and all three of tonight's panelists for their prophetic voices and vision and for their leadership in the ongoing struggle to dismantle racism and white supremacy in our nation. Submit those at any time in the chat that is to the right of the live stream on YouTube, or by using the web form. If you use the web form to link to this live stream, you can click the blue button that reads Submit a Question. And to introduce now Dr. Adam Clark, who will be facilitating the conversation this evening. Dr. Clark is an associate professor of theology at Xavier University, who is committed to the idea that theological education in the 21st century must function as a counter story. He had the privilege of studying under Dr. James Cone at Union Theological Seminary, and Dr. Clark currently serves as the co-chair of the Black Theology Group at the American Academy of Religion. He actively publishes in the area of Black theology and Black religion, and also participates in a number of social justice groups at Xavier and here in Greater Cincinnati. So welcome, thank you for hosting tonight, Dr. Clark. Thanks to all of you who are joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. We initially organized this conversation around COVID-19 and the racial health gap. But in light of the recent police murders of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as well as the hunting and killing of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia, and the fake 9/11 call on Christian Cooper, we decided that this conversation needed to go in another direction. What we're witnessing is the convergence of two framing narratives. The narratives of the virus referred to as COVID-19 and the virus of white supremacy that's existed at least since 1619. One is a medical crisis, an infectious disease that causes illness and sometimes death. The other is an organizing logic that structures the world and our interpretation of it and values life in white bodies over life in Black bodies. As recently as last December, nobody was immune from COVID-19. So everyone should theoretically have an equal opportunity of being infected. Yet as we enter June, Blacks are 4 to 5 times likely to die of COVID-19 than whites. Now, the virus of white supremacy is even more lethal. It's killed more Blacks through slavery, which was legal, segregation, legal, the new Jim Crow, legal, and the legalized brutality and killing of Blacks by the hands of the police. The patience and tremendous restraint of the Black community in the face of so much provocation boiled over last weekend, where folks took to the streets in order to be heard. And the languages of resistance, violence versus nonviolence, riots versus rebellion, protesters versus looters, became the topic of front page news. And the irony, the utter irony, that is that in the midst of a pandemic that disproportionately kills Black people are forced to protest the police that disproportionately kill Black people. That's what philosophers refer to as the absurd. But to help us unpack and think through all this, we've invited some spiritually grounded veteran activists who know a thing or two about struggling for social change. I know you've heard their names already, but I'm going to repeat this. First off, we have the Reverend Nelson Pierce, senior pastor of Beloved Community Church, director of Xavier's Faith and Race program. Nelson came to maturity as an activist during the struggles in Ferguson. I refer to him as the ninja because at every activist or protest event I go to, he's always there in the shadows. He's able to be two places at once. The brother's magical. Love the brother. Second, we have our local revolutionary, Iris Rowley, who's a veteran activist of police and policy reform. She consults with community organizers, attorneys, plaintiffs, city officials all throughout the country, original member of the Black United Front, and also a Black business owner, Roadshow Awards and Graphics. She's a woman I voted most likely to have a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other, Harriet Tubman style. Right. You're gonna be free or die tonight. And finally, we have the Reverend Damon Lynch, the preeminent community leader of Cincinnati, Ohio, senior pastor of the New Prospect Baptist Church, and an informal pastor to community activists throughout the city. He's a pastor's pastor, an activist, my personal pastor, but I share him with others. So I would like to start us out tonight, with an open-ended question. The question raised by Marvin Gaye, what's going on? What's going on?
Well, let's start with the elder. That's how I was raised.
And who might that be? What's going on? I don't know.
What's on your mind?
The rest of the lyrics of the song. Marvin had a lot of great songs. As a matter of fact, songs back in the day were addressing these very issues that we're facing right now. It's been an interesting 6 months. The first 6 months of 2020 have been like nothing I don't think we've seen before. With the pandemic, as we watched that begin in Wuhan, China, make its way through Italy, come across the waters, and then impact America more than it's impacted any other part of the world. And then eventually, as things always happen, disproportionately impact the Black community. So it comes all the way from China to here, and the Black community in America is disproportionately impacted and affected by this virus. We're already disproportionately impacted by poverty, morbidity rates, lack of housing, inequality in education. And so now we add this, and of course you mentioned police brutality. So for the first 6 months of 2020, we've dealt with a pandemic. People have had to stay at home. People have lost their jobs. People may eventually lose their homes. And now we have protests around the country, righteous protests. You mentioned the death of George Floyd. And I watched the video again today, and I'll say this and I'll stop. I watched the video again today, and to hear his words, to hear him cry out. First he said, "I can't breathe." But then he said, "Somebody please help me. Somebody please help me." Now, normally when you are being brutalized and assaulted and somebody's trying to kill you, who do you call? You call, if you 911. But he couldn't call that because the people brutalizing him was 911. So then he said, somebody please help me. And those watching, those videoing, they couldn't help. So finally, his final cry is to his mother. And when we all found out that his mother had died years ago, and this is a strong Black man. If you saw him, I mean, he was buffed, he was big, he was strong, but he was relegated now to being crushed on the ground. And the only person he could think that would hear his cry was his mother, who was already in heaven. And it breaks my heart. When you think of Ahmaud Arbery being chased through the streets of our country by men in a pickup truck with shotguns and guns, and then he dies right there on the street, you ask what's going on? America has not changed. And I don't know. I don't know. It's painful. So let me just stop right there and just say it's painful right now.
Adam, I think that the universe, one, is trying to tell us something. One, with the pandemic, Mother Earth is mad. Go sit down, take a break, reflect, replenish, and then come back. Two, I think energetically we're unbalanced because the rightful people refuse to take their place. The other day I spoke in Washington Park at a rally with the young people. And all I could think when I got there was, I'm looking for the leaders of the free world. And those happen to be Black women. Because we refuse to take our rightful place. We don't know that we're supposed to be in this place, and we are Mother Nature. We are the mothers of the world. And so I think those two things collapse with all the supremacy, racisms, self-hate, loathing, diabolical thoughts of we're not worthy of anything great or good, have positioned us to be in this place where we are just as a people. Now, the rest of the people who don't look like me, they got their own stuff to bear. But I think that those two things are greatly going on, and we refuse to take the time. Well, some forces have told us to get back out there. So you don't have the time to sit and wallow in the mess that we have created. And so when we don't, we can't identify it. And then to identify it means that you need to go back and fix it on the collective. So I think that as a people, we're missing the earth being off its axis. And so we are off our axis. And thus we're in this epidemic, pandemic, destruction of construction somebody's trying to construct for us and to us. That's what I think was going on.
So my response to what is going on is, in the simplest terms, the world is on fire, and there's a saying that if America catches a cold, that Black people catch pneumonia. And I would say that if the world is on fire, then Black people are catching hell. And this is what we are experiencing. This is what we experienced with the way that COVID-19 spread very quickly along racial divisions, and Black people took the brunt of that. And then couple that with the fact that in these first 5 months of 2020, the crime rate has been at historic lows in the United States. We've had less burglaries, we've had less armed robberies, we've had less assaults, we've had less killings in most cities. And across the nation, the crime rate has gone down. The one thing that has not gone down nationwide is the number of police killings. And so despite the fact that the crime rate is the lowest that it's been, in quite a long time. The number of people, and particularly the number of Black people that police have killed, has remained the same. We are at the same number this year as we were last year, which means that it proves the point that we've always known, that the police presence in Black communities is not in relation to crime. And so there is an underlying issue of policing in the way that policing happens in Black communities that needs to be rooted out. I think what we have seen is that the video of our dear brother Floyd's murder has sparked a nerve around the world. There's something about this 8-minute video in which this police officer is on brother Floyd's neck 2 minutes and 53 seconds after he is non-responsive. That is absolutely, that grips the mind and the heart and the imagination in the same way that Bloody Sunday did on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And so this has erupted, not just around the country in the number of protests that have emerged, but literally around the world. They are protesting in Brazil. They are protesting in Canada. They are protesting in Germany. They are protesting in England. And not because they are mad about what's happened in Minnesota, but because what happened in Minnesota is bringing to surface the injustice that they are experiencing, that Black people are experiencing all around the world with policing. And so there is a movement that I think, I hope, I pray is just beginning to emerge, where people around the world are seizing the spirit of this moment and rising up in a unified voice. And my prayer is that this is a moment where we can begin to move the needle of justice in strong and dramatic ways.
Thank you. Look, and I want to take off from that point. I want y'all to help us unpack the dominant media narrative that takes what Nelson just pointed out to as a global protest that's really based on police violence, brutality, and cruelty. And now the media narrative has somehow morphed into a public debate about whether violence or nonviolence are the only legitimate way. Well, I guess to say that nonviolence is the only legitimate form of protest, right? So there's all this conversation about looting, about riots. How would you unpack for people who would say that peaceful protest is the only valid form of protest, and that versus people who say, look, we tried Colin Ferguson peaceful protest, you didn't hear him, right? So therefore, there was a stronger kind of resistance, language of resistance after that, versus the people who just disqualify the entire protest because of looters and rioters and those type of categories. How would you unpack that for people?
Damon, you want to go?
You can go, dear.
No. I heard you answer that question the other day, so I want to hear what you got to say. I want to see if you do it the same way.
Well, normally when it's posed to me like that, I don't address it like that. I did 2 interviews today, one with Fox 19, and that's the road they wanted to go down. What do you see out happening in the streets right now? And what I still see is the officer with his knee in the neck of George Floyd. My attention has not been taken away from the violence that precipitated the protest. I see the difference between systemic violence and the reactionary violence that they may be trying to show or think that I should pay attention to. the systemic violence, which has lasted now for 400 years, over 400 years, and that continues, and then the reaction to it. I'm more interested in how we address the violence that we'll face again after the 6, 7, 10, 12 days of protest. We'll still be dealing with the systemic violence and white supremacy. And it's not just police brutality, it's systemic violence throughout the entire systems. It's systemic violence in the court system, in the prison system, every system that impacts our lives. So I just don't allow people to do that. And I think I just shared this on Facebook today. And for those who can see it, says, here's an example of how white privilege sounds. You keep saying it's horrible that an innocent Black man was killed, but destroying property has to stop. It says, try saying it's horrible that property is being destroyed, but killing innocent Black men has to stop. And they're prioritizing the wrong part of the issue. So, and I shared this past Sunday, from Jeremiah chapter 1 says, God calls Jeremiah and said, here's your challenge, here's your charge. You got to pluck up, tear down, and destroy, overthrow. And then he says, build and plant. So he gives this prophet this crazy call because he's dealing with a wayward nation. And your challenge is pluck up, tear down, destroy, overthrow. And clearly that's what needs to happen in America. And then he says, build and plant. And what has happened is we've been trying to build and plant in soil that is fertilized with racial animus. And so we build and plant, and yet we end up right where we were. So we have to destroy these systems that impact our lives. And then when we build, there's 3 things we have to do. We've got to build, support, and protect. So whatever we build, whatever systems we build, whatever we put together, we've got to build it, support it, and protect it, because we've built before in the past. And I don't know if this is the anniversary of Tulsa or not, because I've seen people put it online. We've built in the past, but if you don't protect it and support it, you can lose it. And we're beginning to lose our own communities, our institutions. So I don't really allow people to take me down the road of whether they're rioters, looters, protesters, rebellion, civil unrest, civil disobedience. Before he put the knee in the neck of Brother George Floyd, nobody was breaking windows. People were going about their daily lives. And then finally, people don't remember, but in 1908, in the suffragette movement, women fighting for the right to vote, they had something called Black Friday. You know what the women went out and did? They went out and broke windows in their effort to secure the right to vote. On that Black Friday in 1908, they went out and broke windows. So that's not a new thing, obviously.
They also do that in championship sporting events. After someone wins a championship, they burn cars and break windows too. But I'll let y'all talk about it.
Damon, were you done? Because I want to pick up on where you left off.
Go ahead.
I too don't allow people to lead me down that path. So I did an interview Saturday, Friday. Of course, the collaborative agreement is the conversation. And because we've been able to build it, plant it in our own soil and maintain it. When I thought you said anniversary, I thought you were going to say of Timothy Thomas, which would be 20 years this year. And so because we fought for us and by us, we've been able to maintain, sustain it, and then lend it some of its tentacles to other people and many, many parts of the country so that they could do the same thing. But when people ask me that question, well, does yesterday change anything or the day before? And I know already what they're talking about because we've been down this road before. It's the same conversation in 2001. Well, Reverend Lynch, you can't let them tear up over the Rhine. Irish, well, what does that mean when they break in the store? Well, when the question was asked was, what have these couple of days changed anything? I said, well, what changed? Did the other 3 officers who helped murder Brother Floyd, were they arrested and charged? So has that changed? because that's the real violence. Let's talk about the violence. All these other things that people are talking about, as Reverend Lynch said, you can replace. You cannot bring that dear brother back. And I think that where we finally are at are places where you really are dismantling systems that support the murder, rape, and pillage of Black people. So a couple of Fridays ago, and because we've been at the table and doing this work for 20 years with the city, and we invited the FOP, and we'll tell that story in a bit of how we got here and why we did it the way that we did, because it's the only one in the country that's like it. But we've been doing Zoom calls so that we can still continue to talk to African Americans in this city and across the nation and build on what supports the police officer that you pay to provide a service to you, to bring his bias or his raggedy self or whatever he learned at home, school, church, wherever, from his mama, daddy, grandparents, uncles, and aunts, and decide that he's going to take your life because he has on a utility belt with tools in it, and because he has backup, and he has a car, and he has a whole force. And the conversation steered around qualified immunity. And I just want to read to you, and I don't know, Reverend Lynch, if you heard Sherlyn say this, because I didn't. I had to go back and listen to her say it to us again. But as a part of the Civil Rights Act of 1871, Congress allowed individuals to sue state and local officials, including police officers who violated their rights. Starting in 1967, y'all ready? The Supreme Court began gutting that law by inventing the doctrine of qualified immunity. Under qualified immunity, police are immune from liable unless the person whose rights, are immune from liability unless the person whose rights they violated can show that there is a previous case in the same jurisdiction involving the exact same facts in which a court deemed the actions to be a constitutional violation. Now, how difficult is it to prove that in court? How difficult is it to prove that in a complaint when written? I was told today that the complaint that was written against the officer who killed Mr. Floyd was not written in the way that it would have been written if it were you or I. And that they have one opportunity for oppression, and they can go through the court, and if they can't prove it, then they get away. But in this day and time, we have several civil rights acts, including the Legal Defense and Educational Fund, fighting to reverse it. So there are things that are occurring that people are really trying to get to the root cause of how people are allowed to brutalize us. And I think that in this COVID state, since we have a little time, we're able to look at those and then dig deeper. And I think those connections from the national fight to the local fight will help us, as Rev said, plant seeds in dirt that will give us what we need to survive and thrive and live in a world of which we choose.
So what you both seem to be pointing to is that there's an institutional violence that pre-exists even the reaction to it, and that the protesters are reacting to an institutional violence, right? So there's a cycle that goes on there. And it's unfair to talk about the reaction as stronger than the establishment of the violence, right?
Right.
Yeah, but Adam and Damon and Nelson, I don't know, how do we deem which police murder is more atrocious than the other? Shooting Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old, Sam DuBose in the face, my cousin who suffered from mental health issues, tasing them to death. Which is more egregious? How is one more egregious than the other? I think that what we have the opportunity of doing is seeing these things now. How many Black men and women and children were lynched, and their fingers and their thumbs and their toes and their noses and their eyes were gouged out, right? So this really isn't about the people of the color. This is about the people who have the power to do that. This is for them to fix and not us. And I think that we keep trying to do something that it is truly up to them.
I would, on that point, I would would say that one of the things that it continues to happen in America is the mythologizing of the destructive, out of control Black person or Black community. And that narrative is fed largely to white America, but also to middle class Black America, to try to create emotional separation between Black struggle and those whose hearts lean towards justice. And the way we see it playing out now is that these questions are emerging about the legitimacy of protest if there is destruction, which I would argue there's a difference between destruction and violence, but that's a separate argument. But what is being discussed not enough yet is that the reports from people who care to investigate is proving over and over again that it's not Black people who are doing most of the destruction. The governor of Minnesota said that their evidence suggests that it's white supremacists, white people who have proven connections with white supremacist organizations who are causing most of the destruction in Minnesota. There's been video evidence that is making its way around social media that shows police officers in uniform smashing windows in buildings. Mm-hmm. There are people who have videotaped their confrontation of white people who are looting stores, or who are spraying graffiti on buildings, trying to intervene with them for the fear that Black people will be retaliated against for the actions of white people. People who have been on the streets in Cincinnati when the destruction has happened over these last couple of days have video and pictorial evidence and have seen with their eyes that it's been white people who have caused much of the damage. And when you look at the places which have been targeted, the fact that Black Coffee had their window smashed, the fact that the barbecue place over on Race Street had its window smashed, in a downtown that's full of white businesses, the fact that it's the Black businesses that are having a disproportionate impact also confirms my hunch that what we are seeing in Cincinnati is similar to what has been proven in Minnesota, is similar to what we experienced in Ferguson, is that the violence isn't coming largely from Black communities, that the violence is largely coming from white people who are using the legitimate anger of Black people as a cover to create violence. In some ways, I believe, to further this narrative of a destructive Black community to try to delegitimize the protest. It's a similar ploy to what happened in 1915 when the film A Birth of a Nation was created to tell a story about Black people who were so violent that they would go around killing white men and raping white women, that was used to further the attacks and restrictions of rights, the lynchings that happened in the southern states in the United States. A film to which the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, reportedly said, "This is like writing history with lightning. My only regret is it is so true." And that this narrative that Black people are violent, we are destructive, is lifted up time and time again as a way of trying to say that somehow our cause is unjust. And we got to reject the premise that the violence, that the destruction that is happening to buildings is linked to the protest that's happening. And unless people are bringing better evidence than what the governor of Minnesota and what these video cameras are showing, I reject that premise wholeheartedly.
That's a great point. And I want to go to Iris with this, because Iris was at was at least 2 protests over the weekend. I was supposed to say that? Oh, I'm sorry.
You're not supposed to tell anybody. I'm supposed to be self-quarantined, man.
Okay, I don't know who said that. But
Right.
what I'd like to ask Iris in relationship to Nelson's question is, what is the racial composition of the protests? And how would you respond to people who say that white people on the far left hijacked a Black protest and compromised its moral character by looting and rioting and destroying property? How would you respond to that? Because I think even Trump is making that by making Antifa, right, like a terrorist organ, or designating Antifa as a terrorist organization.
So just like the first question you asked about the violence, I really don't give those a lot of conversation. Is very short because we are distracted from the bigger things. A man was lynched last week, right? And so if you watch people's Facebook Live posts on Friday when they started, marching down Vine Street was a gaggle of white folks. But let me take you back to 2001, to the civil unrest in the city of Cincinnati. And I think that there are things that play into it, right? So when people know that organizations of Black people, we got this particular issue, like the Black United Front had the police brutality issue. And so when we would call a protest or rally or gathering, we had enough brothers and sisters in place that we knew who people were. And so because they showed up in 2001, we have pictorials of that, right? Oh, you remember Reverend Lynch, Timothy Thomas's funeral? I can show you photos where the same white folks showed up with signs, Black Power, police brutality, stop killing Black people, to draw attention away from what was actually happening. So we watched them, and whether we went to Louisville, we would see the same people. It's like people who chase tornadoes. These people chase our pain, and they benefit off of it for whatever reasons they're doing over there. I don't know, but they are. When we hit Ferguson, and Reverend Lynch likes to tell us a story about me missing the plane because I'm late to everything. But when I got there that Monday morning, he said to me, keep your eyes open, you're going to see something. Right? And Ferguson was what, 2015?
14.
14? Yeah. So 2001, 2002, 2014, the years in between, still the same white guys. We would see them. And I was like, oh yeah, you could start to pick people out. Right? So when you saw them here, I said, well, look at all the white people walking down Vine Street Friday night. I think Black people went over the Rhine. They all had their phones. They were all like, wow, So it was a duality thing for me. Like, yeah, they need to go handle it. This is their stuff to handle. Go handle it. This is yours. Go fix it. Go get your uncle who killed my uncle, and go get your father, who's the prosecutor, make him prosecute him, then go get your other granddaddy, who happens to be the judge, and then go get your other uncle on your husband's side, who's the sheriff, and make him lock him up. So yeah, it was a duality thing. But then I felt like trying to take over our stuff, because I've been pushed a lot these last couple of days about the work of the collaborative, and its sustainability and what we're doing, and making sure people know what we're doing, and all that good stuff. Mm-hmm. Then I watched later on that night, and I saw the composition change. But before I even saw what was happening, I knew what was going to happen because we watched it in 2001. We watched it in Ferguson. We watched the white boys come in, and they would be the ones to throw because they're well-oiled, they are well-funded, they're well-trained. They have way more resources than we do. They come with the right gear, the goggles for the eyes, the mask so you can breathe, because they know that they're going to incite the police enough that there's going to be some retaliation. And while we're standing around like deer in the headlight looking like, hey, what the hell's going on? They done booked. They stick and move. They're gone. And so when you look around.
Are they sharing the same purpose though? Do they come there with the same purpose? Are they really there for the murder of George Floyd? Is that the concern, or is there a separate agenda that's being added to the agenda of the initial protest?
Well, what I was getting to was based on behavior, you can make a determination on that, based on behavior. And so what I watched Saturday night, based on their behavior, they were not trying, it was not about getting justice for Brother Floyd and or his family and all the other millions of Black folks that have been killed at the hands of the police. That wasn't it. It was to construct destruction. And what I watched by the end of the night was brothers and sisters being arrested because they are hyped up off of somebody else's manufactured anger. Because they then, if you watch them long enough, they will change their clothes. They were on bikes. And as I said earlier, they would stick and move. And so we were, if you listen to my Saturday night Facebook Live, I'm like, why y'all throwing? Shit, stop. Because they coming. And most of us aren't ready. And when I say us, most of the Black people who are being killed at the hands of the police are not ready for that. Because we're not throwing the bottles, the sticks. They were literally taunting the SWAT people. So some of them probably were there to help stand, and they really wanted to liberate their souls and be the good white people and help us get what we needed to get. But then there were some based on their actions that were just there to construct destruction.
So Adam, I don't know how much time we have, but you've got a load of questions over here.
I know, that's what I was about to go to. And I was about to come to you with the question that directly is for you, Reverend Lynch. It's from Pete. It says, Reverend Lynch, there's a chat question. No one's interested in COVID, okay? Like, everybody's talking about the protest. So we could go to the protest. We might have to do COVID another time. But Pete says, Reverend Lynch, you were a key voice in the dialogue and reforms following Timothy Thomas's death, What has worked? What hasn't worked? What would you recommend to other communities?
Okay, so again, that's really an Iris question, but I'll couple that one with the next question is, can you suggest good evidence-based model programs for reducing police brutality? And clearly, what came out of the civil unrest and the protests in Cincinnati was something called a collaborative agreement, where we filed a class action lawsuit against the city of Cincinnati that went to federal court. The Justice Department came in. We decided to do something different than other cities had done. Pittsburgh, right before us, came out with a consent decree with many of the same things that we would end up with, but we wanted to do it so that not only did we change policies, practices, and procedures, but how do you bring a community together? How can you make Cincinnati better? So we brought the police to the table, the city, the FOP, Cincinnati Black United Front, and the community. I think over 3,100 people had a part in crafting this, making this happen. That work is now in Ferguson. We went to Ferguson, not just during the time of the unrest, although we were on West Florissant, but we went back and we met with the, what was it, committee or council? What was it called, Iris?
We met with the ACLU, we met with clergy, we met with chiefs.
I know, but eventually they set up the
Ferguson Commission.
Ferguson Commission. So we met with the Ferguson Commission. They adopted a lot of our work. If you read the judge's order in New York, when they stop and frisk, he references the work that we did in Cincinnati. So to Sarah's question, that was a model of not only gaining reforms, but building better relations in the community. So it's not perfect, and police brutality, I'm sure, happens still in Cincinnati every single day. Individual police officers, I'm still sure, violate people's rights, but there are a lot of great reforms in that. So, and we are proud of it, and we are now refreshing it to keep those reforms alive. And as a matter of fact, and Iris may share, we've had conversations already with people in Minneapolis to share that with them as well.
So let me say this, Sarah, I don't wanna take away anything, because one of the things that Black people typically do is not celebrate the good work, whether how small or how big. And in the 20th year of this work, I wanna make sure that people understand that before Timothy Thomas was murdered by Officer Roach, we were already in conversations and had signed the agreement. So we got busy after what we called in Cincinnati the 2 and 24, Jeffrey Irons and Roger Owensby Jr. And that's when the Black community said to us, please do something, Cincinnati Black United Front. And that was the catalyst that got us going, because we switched from the 14 out of the 34 downtown restaurants closing during the largest revenue generating event, which is the Music Fest. We know it as the Music Fest. Back in the day, it was the Jazz Festival. So I wanted you to understand that we sprung into action after the 2 and 24, and to tell the story correctly, because we were actually in federal court when they murdered Timothy Thomas. And so that was painful, because we were in the middle of the work to have to endure another senseless death of a young Black man in the year 2001.
So, and Adam, if you take Dan B's question and Quentin's question, and I think Nelson could handle those two because they're dealing with church.
Well, you know, I wanted Nelson to handle the first one from Malik, who asked about how non-African American people. I've gotten this question a lot, so I want Nelson to do it. Okay, how can it says non-African American people of color, but I want to just say non-African American people, period, most effectively advocate against systematic racism? How would you recommend people join the conspiracy of hope against racism?
Yeah, so I think all advocacy work begins with internal reflection, and what non-Black people of color, what it is easy to forget in moments like this is that racism, even though it is targeted towards Black people the most, that all people of color are swept up in it. And in any given moment, your proximity to whiteness can shift at a moment's notice. And all you have to do is think about what happened in at the beginning of 2020, when the occupant of the White House began talking about COVID-19 as the Chinese virus. And now all of a sudden, anti-Asian American sentiment rose through the roof. The coalitions between Black people and people of color, it's important to strengthen those, not just for the sake of Black people, but it's also important because the same winds that sweep us up constantly also sweep up other people. And the fight against racism is a fight for all people of color. I remember in Huntsville, Alabama, in 2000, it was late 2014, early 2015, there was a doctor who had brought his father from India over to be there for the birth of their child, his father's grandchild. And his father had never been to the United States. He did not speak English, was walking down the street. Somebody called the police because there was a dark-skinned person walking down the street. The police rolled up on the man, ordered him to put his hands up. He doesn't understand the order because he doesn't speak English. And because he refuses to comply with an order that he doesn't understand, the police tackle him, fracture his face on the pavement, and then arrest him. And it isn't until much later that the doctors and nurses discover that the man doesn't speak English, because the police never bothered to do that much work, right? These things impact other people of color, and you have to, so doing that self-work to understand that in the history of America, almost every other ethnic group has been impacted in some way, shape, or form. And just because it isn't your turn now doesn't mean it can't be. And so this work isn't about just being there to support Black people, but it's also being there for yourself. When you begin to understand that, your advocacy shifts. I say it's the same thing for white people who want to be involved in the work. Is to understand that the reason that racism continues to be perpetuated is because it keeps the economic system in place. And as long as poor white people do not organize with poor Black people, the economic systems stay in place, and that racial division helps the economic status quo to stay in place. And so when poor white people begin to realize, poor and middle class white people begin to realize that racism also keeps your economic level lower than what it could be if we had a just system, then they will wake up, I believe, and begin to organize as well. And then it's not an issue, it's the same thing. It's not an issue of you coming out to support me because you feel bad about what's happening to me, but I want you out here in the streets marching because you realize that what is happening to me is also impacting your daily life.
Yes. Here's what I think for Reverend Lynch. This is from James. In what ways could Black people change and control the narrative and tell a more authentic story about themselves? And at what point could outrage and energy be harnessed and channeled more constructively?
Okay. So, well, first of all, Nelson, you did a great job, because you also touched on Anna's question that we always get, as well as how can white people be part of the struggle? What role can they play? Mm-hmm. And I think before I get to James's question, the problem that
there's a lot of those questions. I just don't want to forefront all that. It's not going to be about how we can relate to white people all the time. So there's a lot of questions that attract in the whole thing about white allyship, doing that. I respect it, but I don't want that to dominate this conversation, because that's part of the problem in the first place, right? So
I was going to say that.
So that's why I want you to speak to how Black people can control their narrative, their own narrative.
All right. Well, what we did in 2001, if Iris remembers, there was an organization called the Cincinnati Black United. We were organized. Just bottom line, we were organized. And at that time, the socialist people came in and they had to meet with us and get permission. Could they be part of the protest, part of the movement? And we actually told them no. And other people came in, but they had to meet with us before they could be in the streets with us or part of the movement. There was an organization that was putting together the protests, the marches, the boycotts, the lawsuits. And so if you just have this organic thing, which is fine, but you know, who's organizing the protest tonight downtown? I mean, or yesterday or tomorrow. I think the best way to control the narrative is that, number one, you create it, but you have to be organized. And the more organized you are, the better able you are is to control your narrative and keep people out that you don't want to be a part of it. And the more organized you are, the more respected you are, and the more powerful you are. So we had power in numbers, we had power in being organized, and we were able to tell people you are not welcome here, or if you are here, as a matter of fact, I mean, what we used to always say is, go back to your own community and do the work. Because we didn't allow anybody to come in and take over our movement.
And we weren't trying to make white folks feel good just by joining the work. And especially when we're talking about work as it relates to law enforcement and just that in that space right there, right? So there are a lot of people that run in that and create whole lots of economic mobility for their families in that particular space. People understand what they choose to understand. And then people come to you with a heavy heart of, oh, what can I, we just had a lady on our Friday call, 80 years old, extremely rich. And she says, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
I think every Black person that was listening was like, write a check, lady. Because that's what's missing. But here's the bigger picture. So you talked about the narrative. We need to stop allowing people to create a narrative and following that narrative. Because in the city of Cincinnati right now, while we still do have challenges with the Cincinnati Police Department and all the other 39 police municipalities that surround us, including the sheriffs and Children's Hospital Police and the universities police, including your campus, that's not the number one issue for us. It's not. And we need to stop allowing people to make policing such a ginormous issue in our space and place. The biggest issue that is a challenge for us, and as a business owner for the past 18 years, is economics. It was an issue in 2001. If it were not an issue, costing the city, how much did we cost the city, Damon? You say one number, I say another.
Last number I saw was $70 million. That's because of the boycott.
And the sanctions. That is how we started to get attention on the work. And it wasn't just about police work. We were across the span of where Black life was, whether it was housing or jobs, Section 3 and health, education. We had all of those areas covered. But because at that time, we had the 2 and 24, and then we had Timothy Thomas right after we signed. So we have to stop allowing people to create our narrative. My story is my story. You can't tell me about being Black. You can't tell me about my Black sons, and you can't tell me about my Black spouse. You can't tell me about being in Black business, and you can't tell me about being on the line for Black people. You can't do it.
So Iris,
I don't allow them to put that on me.
Here's where a lot of these questions are coming from. There are a lot of people who say, in addition to resources or policy changes, how can I stand with you? I don't understand your pain totally, but I'm compassionate to a wrong has been done. How do I stand with you?
I want to know, what do you mean? I mean, so let's start with the resources and let's start with the standing there. Right? Let's not skip past that. That's important.
Right. Okay.
Because
so beloved community church is where we going. Where we going with this?
I'm just saying, none of us who do this work get paid to do this work. We get paid to do other stuff. And this is work we do because we love Black people, because we can't stand idly by, because we can't sleep at night while these things are happening in our communities. And so the support and supporting movement is great. We need that, right? We have a Cincinnati bail fund that Beloved Community Church decided to host because somebody needed to do it. And I'm so grateful for everybody who is given to the bail fund, and I hope people continue to give that. But also supporting.
Tell me what you were doing today, Nelson. Tell me what you were doing today with that.
Yes, I spent all of today in the Justice Center bailing people out of jail who were locked up from the protest over the weekend. And I'll be doing the same thing tomorrow. I'll be back there tomorrow bailing people out of jail.
So people who want to stand with you need to help with the resources, give to that fund. That would be a concrete way.
That is a concrete thing. But also don't forget us when CNN turns to a different story, when we are not the flavor of the month, and CNN is not talking about our pain. Remember that you live in the city with us. And one of the things that happened for Damon and Iris after their amazing work around the collaborative agreement was that Cincinnati turned a cold shoulder to them for many, many years. And it's only been recently that people have started to warm up a little bit more. But they suffered a tremendous amount of backlash for that after they had stopped being on the front lines and after they stopped being in negotiating rooms. People around the country were saying, hey, this is great work you all were doing in Cincinnati. And people in Cincinnati were trying to forget Damon and Iris's name and the names of all of the people who are working on in the Cincinnati Black United Front, who are on the front lines and in the boardrooms of this work. And so it's important not to forget the people who are doing the work once this is over. And the work is, so it's a privilege for me and for us to be here. But there are other people and other organizations who are doing great work. Mona Jenkins at the Homeless Coalition, and the Homeless Coalition is doing amazing work around this. There are tremendous Black activists, some of whom don't even have an organization that they are working with or working for. They're just out there because they feel it. And so doing the work of going, finding out, and helping to think about how do you support the ongoing work that individuals are doing is so critically important.
So let me tell you how white folks can stand with Iris Rowley, because I am a business owner and it is what feeds me. And we're not done negotiating. We're still at the table. We just submitted documents to the city manager and the chief for continuation of the implementation of the refresh recommendation. So we're not done. But how you can support me, because I do not get paid, as Nelson said, because I do own a legitimate business. And I want to thank those who are in the Zoom room and those who are listening to us that shop at Roadshow Awards and Graphics. We are the only African Americans that do engraving in the region. But we are boycotted daily by the big institutions. Imagine, Adam, Damon, and Nelson, if the school district, if the two universities brought all of their promotional stuff to Roadshow. Just imagine if the 3 giant hospitals that have erected with my tax dollar did all of their promotional items with Roadshow. Just imagine if the city and all of its rec centers brought their workaround trophies to Roadshow. Do you see the picture that I'm painting?
Could you spell Roadshow for people who listen? Spell it.
ROSHO. It is a combination of my married name and my maiden name. It's 5 letters, and we are 2206 Langdon Farm. But the bigger picture is, just imagine if they did do that like they do for other business, like they have for generations and generations, that are able to continue to hire those that look like them and to be in service to their wealth and their way of life, that they can afford medicine, food, the proper foods, proper clothing, proper education, right? Transportation. So just imagine if that occurred. So I'm still, Nelson, I don't know if it's gotten warm, because the work is still, that culture of policing is one of such that we get to do what we want to do. The whole thing around the FOP, the whole Fraternal Order of Police itself, is a unit that believes that they can do whatever they want to, and they certainly believe that they can do whatever they want to you and I.
Now, there's one.
Stand with me, come see me. Let's do some business.
Gotcha. Now, in this world, we're supposed to be physically distancing. And I think racism has been racism so much that we forgot about physical distancing. That there's one question about this here, about, does anybody think of all these protests, right, is going to increase the rate of COVID in the Black community so that it might delay reopenings and delay Black businesses? Like, what do you think is going to be the consequence of us going out there? And there's more protests. There's some planned for next week and throughout the week too. So this is not over. But how is that going to affect us in terms of, we're already dying disproportionately from COVID-19? And then we're out there trying to equally protect ourselves from a police force that we're disproportionately dying from. How, if we win the battle, can we possibly still lose the war because of this COVID? How y'all feel about that? Let me go to Nelson. What you have to say about that?
Nelson?
Yeah. So first of all, my first thought is that when you are in reaction mode, when you are fighting for your life, you don't have time to weigh the consequences. You have to act and you have to react. And that's what's happening in so much of the protests out there. You can see people are taking measures to protect themselves. People are wearing masks. At the beginning of this, I had just taken off my mask that I've been wearing all day while I was out there in the courtroom, and people are doing their best. You see people who want to hug each other and run up and then stop and give each other elbow pats. So people are doing their best to take precautions in these while they are out. And at the same time, I think there are so many people who feel compelled that to remain at home in this time is to do a grave injustice to the moment. There are the number of ways that if the country were serious, and if our nation's leaders were serious, and our city and states leaders were serious about stopping this, the number of ways they could intervene is it's too long to list. But because we know that Black people are disproportionately impacted, we also ought to be disproportionately invested in for this, right? And so it shouldn't have had to take Damon and Iris to their work with CEAI and their partners to bring a testing site into a Black community in Cincinnati. Those should have been the first place where testing sites went. It shouldn't have to be Black people always having to fight for investment in Black communities. The disproportionate number of resources should go there, right? The way that the government bailed out the auto industry in the crash in 2008, why couldn't the $1 trillion stimulus package go to Black businesses? Why couldn't they go to Black businesses first? Let's make sure that Black businesses are whole and healthy and survive this crisis, and then let's deal with everybody else. But instead, we've got to depend on the Los Angeles Lakers and Shake Shack and Ruth Chris to give money back because they took millions of dollars and got caught and shamed in it, while businesses are struggling, while small businesses are struggling. And so the way that capitalism operates changes these questions so much that we are asking about Black people at higher risk, when we should be asking about why is the capitalist infrastructure that we are a part of continuing to create these no-win situations where you have to choose between dying of a virus or dying at the hands of police brutality. That's a ridiculous and absurd choice. And we have to question those decisions and those choices first and foremost.
Well, you know, Adam, one of my very thoughtful non-birth children called me yesterday, sent me breakfast and said, Mama, you being out on the protest line is serving white supremacy. Because if you get sick and die, then whose voice will we hear? Right. And don't I have to think about it, because I've been in the house, but so compelled to go out and make sure that the youth were protected from the police that we say we are monitoring and watching and making sure there's equity and fairness and transparency. And then two, trying to assist them as they organize at the same time. And so when I had to think about it, and I had to take a step back and say, you're absolutely right. Then I got a call today saying, well, they want you to come and they want to make sure that they're ask align with what you're asking, and okay, we can do that. Let me say this to you. For young white folks, white folks can't complain to me about police. I just want to leave it there. And even though there is a percentage of white folk we're seeing now that are being abused by police, until they actually use their power to stop it. And again, the violence that we've seen time and time again, and the reason why we're on this call and people are saying the Reverend Lynch was through very ugly, horrible violence, and we reacted. And so what you're seeing is a reaction to the continued violence. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. But I do want to say something else about COVID, and I'm glad they brought that up. Because Rev tells his story all the time about us hearing about the COVID, Black people dying, Black people getting it twice as much, Black people dying. At first, it was a senior's illness. So I was screaming, let's go make sure we take care of the elders. Let's do it. But it was so amazing because as it turned the corner, went down the street and was turning the corner, I said, shit, this is about to be a Black thing. Just like AIDS is about to be a Black thing. Right. Now, everybody was all in and all about it. when it wasn't a black thing, AIDS, HIV, when it wasn't a black thing. And as soon as it became a black thing, you saw all research stop, all testing stop. You had to scrape and fight to get some help and assistance, just like in the COVID. So as we do, because our ancestors tell us, get up and do something, I think we're on the phone like, this is craziness. We need testing. If we're dying and we're being impacted the most, why can't we walk to a testing site? Why can't we jog to a testing site, ride our bikes to a testing site? Right. So when we called Mercy and we had to call Baltimore to get help with Cincinnati, they had already had how many sites, Rev?
4
up and running, and none in our communities. But these people get our dollar.
Right. And that's why I wanted Damon Lynch to speak to this, because you've been the preeminent leader on trying to fight against COVID-19 in the Black community in Cincinnati, Ohio. So here's the question. How has white supremacy made Black folks more vulnerable to COVID-19? And what's the state of our prison system, COVID-19 in our prison system right now?
Get them, Damon.
Well, clearly the largest number of infected people in the state of Ohio, and probably across the country, is in our prison system. We have one prison here in Ohio, Marion, where over 2,100 people tested positive for COVID-19. And I'm not sure how white supremacy, other than all the underlying factors that African Americans live with, the morbidity factors, the health issues, the poverty, the homelessness, the job rate, those things all contribute. But I don't know. I mean, that's I don't know how you tie white supremacy to that, other than.
Well, part of it's also the disinvestment, right? Like the resource, the lack of resources. So what I say,
but so some of that. Here's what happens, and what Iris and I have been doing for the last 20 years, is that let's go do. You can't put on CNN every night and say it's disproportionately impacting Black people and I just watch that. No, I watch that. We make a phone call. We open the testing site. In our communities, when people talk about how can we be allies, we just can't be allies at a time of crisis. I mean, we are so segregated. And so if you say non-Black colored people, well, we don't get together at all anyway. And when you look at the economy in our communities, and I applaud these groups, so the Indian community controls the motel sections of our economy, the Patels and the Singhs, and Black hair care products controlled by the Korean community. If you get your nails done and your toes done, it's the Cambodian Vietnamese community. If you go to your corner store and the corner gas station, that's the Indian Arab community, American Arab Indian community. And it goes on and on and on and on. And after 400 years, we're challenged to figure out what economic sector do we as an African-American community control. If you park your car anywhere downtown Cincinnati, more than likely it's somebody of Ethiopian descent. And I applaud them, but we don't work together. And so the idea that now all of a sudden in time of crisis, a Black man gets his knee put on his neck and he dies, and we're all going to just work together. No, we have to do that now. So when time of crisis comes, I know who my allies and my accomplices are. Right. And you don't have to be asking questions on this stream of questions like, how can we work together? We're not together. We're not together. But that's a challenge to the African-American community. And so that's a challenge for those of us who we have to fight systemic racism, but we also have to do. So again, I'll close with what Jeremiah said. You got to tear down, pluck up, destroy, overthrow, but you also have to build and plant. And what do you build and plant? You build and plant what you just tore down, the systems that are in our way. You build and plant, but you also have to protect and support what you build. So I just believe now, after 400 years, whether you believe it's 1619 to 2019 or whatever you believe, that it is time now that we start building and planting, which could lead to what we call reparations and separation. We police ourselves, we police our communities, we build our institutions, things that we used to do. I mean, it's not like this is something new. We built institutions, we built Black banks, we built Black credit unions, Black insurance companies, you name it, we had it. We allowed it to go by the wayside, or it was destroyed. So two things, we just can't build it if we're not going to support it and protect it.
Adam, can I say something?
The store was owned by Black people.
Right.
All right, so now let's go. So let's take this new generation, Nelson's guy age and the people behind him, and let's start building. Now our allies, our accomplices can be part of that, but what they become is what we call second investors. People say, well, Damon, how can we help? You can be a second investor into the life of this vision. Because if they are the first investors, which too often we allow them to be, when they decide that's no longer the issue of the day and they pull their investment, then it falls apart. First investors have to be us in every aspect of our lives, the education of our children, the rebuilding of our communities. We are first investors. We are invested in it no matter what happens. And then we go knock on doors. So, hey, you were on this live stream the other day, said you wanted to be an ally. Well, here's how you can help. And we build it.
So before we move on, if I may, if you are in need of testing for COVID, and I do want to thank CEAI, which Pastor Damon Lynch III is president and CEO of the Real Estate Development Corporation, because that's a whole nother, something that we often are allies or people who say they're allies don't want to talk about. We are watching the destruction of Black ownership of homes, land, property in our city. We all watched in our adult lives the takeover of Over the Rhine. And oftentimes I think that the collaborative agreement helped because we made policing digestible to the city. And folks thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread because it was designed and built for us, by us. But they flipped the script. They decided that the corner in Over the Rhine that went across the world as the most dangerous corner in America, and it always baffled me. And I always say to Reverend Lynch, that's the most dangerous corner. What was it, Race and Maine?
Right there at that 5 Points corner. Yeah.
It was the most dangerous corner. Now they sitting out having tacos on Tuesdays and margaritas on Wednesdays and meeting, and they're not physically distancing either. But you got to keep your eye on the prize while one group is doing one thing, the other could be doing the other. So I'm from that. My grandmother was Vivian Kennebrew. She was an RN. She started the Black Nurses Association in the city. She was a hell of an agitator. She wasn't an activist, she was an agitator. Maurice McCracken was her minister. My grandfather was the first Black Bells bondsman in the city of Cincinnati, and he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Don't y'all say nothing about my crazy. So I know who I am and whose I am. And so sometimes when you walk in that purpose and your work is of that purpose, people know. So if you are in need of testing, because we did make a call to get a site in Bond Hill, and some Black folk got mad about that. So that Black folk would have a testing site because Black people were dying. Black people are infected. And so if you are in need, please go to 1701 Mercy Health Way. It was only supposed to be up for 30 days. You remember that, Damon? Now it's indefinite. You can get a test for free if you do not have insurance, Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. Monday through Saturday. If you have any questions, please call 888-700-9011. So we strategically put that there for the usage for African Americans who we're seeing every day, and nobody's coming to save us. You don't see testing all over the city. You see testing in Avondale. It was testing in Avondale for 2 days. That's great, but for 2 days? Are you kidding me? There's a testing site in Avondale on Burnett Avenue right now by one of the health care systems, but it only tests its employees. Are you kidding me? We have three major health care systems in the city. You don't see them racing to begin to talk about testing. And as a matter of fact, I don't know if I've heard any testing talk lately. I've not heard any testing talk about whether it's the antigen test or the antibody test. I've not heard it. I don't even think I got any numbers today from the health department. The health department does testing, but you wouldn't know it because there's no advertising. But if you need a site, yes, they do testing, Nelson. If you need to go to a site to get testing, please make your way to Mercy Health Way, right off of Reading Road at the beginning of Bond Hill, right as you pass 562, that first driveway to your right. They should be waiting on you. Let us know how you're treated and let us know how it comes out.
And I'm sure non-Black allies could actually form solidarity on testing, protective equipment, prison, and those type of things in terms of resources as well, right? Like we need a whole bunch because there's a resource deficit, so that people who have resources who are concerned about this issue can actually make a effective intervention. But I wanted to come to Nelson with a big meta question about what is this virus, if anything? What is it teaching us? What are we learning from this whole experience?
I think we are learning that the world is a lot smaller than often we remember. And because the world is smaller than we remember, that we cannot afford to ignore suffering anywhere. King is always quoted as saying that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it's the same thing with suffering anywhere. And so that when we turned a blind eye, or our government misled us about the coronavirus and COVID-19 because it was in other countries and it was not here, and which slowed our reaction to it, that we have to remember that we can't afford to not to pay attention to that. Which also means, in this situation we're talking about police brutality, is that what happened to George Floyd doesn't just happen to Black people. It does disproportionately happen to Black people. But white people are also the victims of police violence. And this is why I always say you have to look at how this impacts you in your community, because these injustices impact everyone. So the world is smaller than we think. The second is that our system is not as entrenched as we think it is. And so in a matter of weeks, the way that we lived and worked and operated came to a screeching halt, and we figured out new ways to live and work and operate. And so all of the things that seem like they are inevitable, that seem like they are too hard to change, that they have to be because they always have been, that's not true. That we can be imaginative, we can invoke a prophetic imagination into all of the ways that we live and work and operate together, because COVID has taught us that it's possible. That there is a resiliency. The third thing I would lift up is there is a resiliency that the planet has, and that there's a resiliency that exists in each one of us in our communities. And so in Los Angeles, one of the cities in the United States that has the highest concentration of air pollution, that a few weeks after the quarantine restrictions happened in California, the air quality in Los Angeles was better than it had been, I think, in 40 years. Because Mother Nature, the earth, is resilient. And if we just stop messing with it, then it can heal. And I'd say the same thing is true about our communities, that our communities are resilient, that we are collaborative and connective by nature. And the reason that one of the reasons why I fight so hard and I push so much on calling out white supremacy is because I believe if white supremacy, if we can get it just a little bit off of our necks, we remember how to collaborate and how to work together. We remember how to build institutions. We remember how to support each other because it's in our nature, it's in our bones, it's in our DNA. Our grandparents did this. Our great grandparents did this. And so it is in our collective muscle memory. And if we can just shake loose of the bonds, the restrictions of white supremacy, then we can remember what we can do and we can rebuild communities. We built empires. Of course we can rebuild our community.
Right, right. Well, we are coming close to the end of our time. I got two questions. One is, I guess this is probably best directed to Reverend Lynch. How do you combat the attitude in the Black community primarily that bad things happen all the time, therefore COVID is just one of many bad things, right? So they don't take it seriously. But maybe Iris, you could speak to it.
But I don't know. I'm not talking. Yeah, Rev, you take that because I'm saying with people that talk like that.
Oh, so it's like bad things happen all the time. This is just one of many bad things. So therefore, I should have to take it seriously.
Is that a prevalent thought?
I think so. I don't know if it's certainly significant enough to be a problem, right? Because if we don't have everybody doing something with this type of disease, you can.
Okay. How do you combat it? I think you first have to understand it. Part of it is just the mistrust of the system and the mistrust of every system in America, and especially around health issues. People will always go back to the Tuskegee experiments, and there's a mistrust. But that wasn't just an African American sentiment. I mean, there were a whole white people and others saying, this thing is not everything they're saying it's going to be. It's not real, and there are people still saying it. I mean, I don't know how you combat that. I mean, obviously you combat it with truth. You combat it with information. I mean, you have African Americans who I do hear that even if there is the vaccine, they're not going to take it. But it just goes back to the mistrust of the system. You just combat it with truth, lead by example, and pray that people, I don't know.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh. It's just, I think, Damon, is what you said, the mistrust and then all that comes with supremacy. And when you internalize it, you say dumb ish like that.
I hear, the 5G theory. I mean, social media now allows people to have any idea they want, and the earth is flat again. And, you try to save as many as you can. Let me just put it like that.
All right, I got you.
As many as you can. And then there's some we just won't be able to save.
My granddaddy told me save the people on the boat.
But that's the problem. Even the folks you can't save could kill us, right? Like that's the problem with this unique situation. And that's what makes it so dangerous and so challenging. But I guess the closing.
Adam, before you move on, I think that to challenge that just a little bit, and I know we were laughing because it's such a difficult thing to digest. I don't think I've had anyone say that to me. And I think because people look at my work, they not dare say that to me. So I think it's our steps that we take. You got Meta Man and you got Jesus here and you got, Harriet. Folks, just don't come to you like that. I'm subject to pull out my 45 if you say something like that. Cause I said that Saturday in the park. I'm just here to free the slaves. So I don't, some people may say that. I just don't think they say that to us. And I'm great.
Black people couldn't get it, right? Y'all heard that Black people couldn't get it, or it's 5G, or it was this, or it's just the flu. There's a whole bunch of mythologies that circle around, and some people got caught up in it. And that's another myth that it was kind of this attitude that it's almost like a certain type of nihilism. Like my life is meaningless anyway, so why should I have to restrict it? To me, I look at it as that society is based on a social contract. We have certain forms of shared agreement, and people who've never felt part of that contract are less likely to go along with physical distancing and the things that we're trying to do because they never felt part of that in the first place. So therefore, they could go and have parties on Memorial Day and swim parties and all these other types of things. And it is a certain form of what we would look at as recklessness, but they were like, I'm going to live my life because I don't know what the future looks like. So if you're not invested in your future, right, there's really no incentive to do all this.
But I think we're dealing with the unknown too. And physical distancing is hard because, man, it's just hard. We're conditioned. I'm a hugger. You know, I want to touch, I want to feel you. I want to, you know, hold your hand. I want to cry, put my head on your shoulder. It's difficult to do. And so then you have to believe in science. And I think, as Rev alluded to, the mistrust, we don't have to just look at the Tuskegee experiment. We can look right here in the city of Cincinnati, you know, with the radiation experiment on Black folks at the University Hospital and cancer. So there are a lot of things that make us go, that don't make sense to me, because it doesn't make sense. It's this airless, colorless thing that's got many more legs and able to kill more people than we ever knew. So we have to trust the science, at least, because the folk who are supposed to be telling us to get prepared is kind of crazy.
Well, and then meet people where they are. The majority, the person who might say that will probably be with you on the issue of police brutality. They've probably experienced more discourteousness from a police officer than they know right now somebody who's tested COVID positive. So let's start with meet them where they are and have a relationship with them. I mean, you know, over 100,000 people have died in this thing from March 13th till now. Huge number, but not like, you know, if there's, you know, what, 300 million people in America? You know, it's so just meet them where they are.
Right.
If I can get you to believe that police brutality and racism is real, maybe eventually I'll get you to put a mask on.
Gotcha. See, night is descending so much, and before I fade out, I want to ask one last question. I really want to turn on a light, but I want to be a good host and still keep with the camera. Here's my closing question to everybody around Robin. During this whole quarantine situation, what has been a spiritual resource or practice that you've done to keep you centered? How have you kept centered during this whole quarantine? Share that with the people so they can actually get some ideas of how to stabilize themselves. And how about Iris? Why would you go first?
No, that's okay. No. You don't want to hear my answer. Okay, go to Metaman or Jesus. go to them too. I have a different way of spiritually removing the spirits that don't allow me to be free and keep me stagnant. So there's several things that I do, but I'm a happily married woman.
Okay. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that, but go ahead, Nelson.
One thing that helps keep me centered and is replenishing to me is actually the act of preaching. Like as I preach, it reminds me of what is true. It reminds me of what's hopeful. And so the act of preaching actually is very, very helpful for me. Secondly, because I'm not great at centering myself outside of that, but my fiance she has developed practices.
I didn't hear about that. Congratulations, brother.
Robin Wright.
Yeah. Is that breaking news?
No, that's not breaking news.
Okay, I'm glad I'm not the only one. So
no. This has been months now. My fiance, Robin Wright, is fabulous at these practices. And so she is a constant reminder for me to take time to meditate, to center myself, to make sure I'm attentive to my breathing. And has actually been doing this work now with our church in the midst of this, of bringing people in the church together in small, intimate groups to share stories and to breathe and to be present with each other. And so those are the things that I've been doing to help in that. And for those who would like that, we do that at our church on Sunday afternoons now. We'll be doing it on Sunday afternoons on Zoom for people who want to plug in, for Black people who want to plug in. This is for Black people to be together and heal.
Or who are perceived as such.
Okay.
You about to marry up, bro. That's what it sounds like.
All right. All right. Iris, would you like to go next or you want to go last?
No, I was gonna say, and I, you know what, and I talk about Black love because it's a foreign thing to many people, and I'll say my husband's full name, and and I find myself having to step back because people will try to talk to me, and see him standing right there. It's an attack on the institutions that help build and raise families. So I love being centered right there. And universe willing, it'll be 26 years this July. But the act of being a servant to my people in such a very humbling way, and the most trying times, keeps you grounded and rooted in who you are. But I was trained early on in the Black House in the community of Avondale. And so, as I said, there are many things that I do. But that is the biggest character reference that allows me to be happy. And then I hang out with great freedom fighters like y'all. I get to hang out with some bad asses. So I'm good.
Yeah, Reverend Lynch. How about yourself?
Well, good. I think what keeps me centered is the challenge. I share all the time with my congregation. I'm not like super spiritual. And maybe that's not the right term, but I'm not like over the top, rah. It's the challenge. What COVID-19 has done for me is I looked, and I tell people, I believe the church was in a pandemic before this pandemic. And for me, what's the challenge? What's the lesson coming out of this? I'm a thinker. I was always taught that if a person can beat you thinking, they'll beat you living every time. I'm a thinker. So I'm looking for the challenge post-COVID, the faith community post-COVID. People want to have conversations. When can we get back in the building, get back in church? I'm not having that discussion. That's, whenever. But how are we going to be different after this? What is God speaking to us, to the faith community? There were a number of questions on here about the role of the church, and so for what centers me is the challenge. I wake up every day to the challenge.
I like that. That's good.
That excites me about life.
Great. Well, thank you, y'all. That's been that's our time. We went a little bit over it to this time. Jeff, would you like to come in?
On behalf of the Bellarmine Dismantling Racism team and Xavier University's Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice, we just want to express our gratitude tonight, Dr. Clark, for facilitating, for moderating, Sister Iris, Sister Rowley, Reverend Pierce, Reverend Lynch, for all the truth that you have spoken tonight, all the ways you have nurtured us as companions in the struggle, called us to deeper action, to knowing we cannot stand idly by. We cannot sleep at night. There is work to be done, much work to be done. Thanks also to all of you who have joined us this evening, and we are hoping that you will share the live stream that will then become available as an archive video on the Bellarmine Chapel YouTube channel. To inspire action, to encourage others. We're raising a lot of important questions about the work to be done at this time to, as Reverend Lynch said, to uproot and to tear down and to dismantle, and then to build and to plant and support and protect. Next month on July 6th, there will be another conversation with Dr. John Snagaki, a Xavier University theology professor, around COVID-19 and the path forward. We'd love for you to join us for that. And in the meantime, as Reverend Pierce suggested, we think, we hope, we pray that there is a movement, a worldwide movement that is rising up at this time to bring about justice in strong and dramatic ways, justice that is lasting. And we thank all of you for your work and your witness in inspiring us and empower us in that. Peace be with you all.
Peace be with you. Thank you. Good night.
Night, everybody.